Where can you find story ideas? Everywhere. Alright, you're looking for a more nuanced answer than that. This video is going to give you a handful of actionable ways to do it. And as we go through them, please know that there is no one single place where ideas come from, because they can come from anywhere or anyone, including ideas that you think of yourself. The most obvious is press releases. And before you scream that press releases aren't news, they're just marketing, please know that you're right. It's the very few times, the once or twice a year, the press release is actually good. And that's because the person behind the scenes who wrote it knew how to get you as a journalist the things that you would be interested in. The people, the video, and is actually pitching an interesting story. Other than that, you're right. The rest are totally marketing. Another reason why I bring them up is because you want to keep your eye out for wacky ones that, going back to the 7 elements, probably have novelty or rarity. One of my mentors, Mike Shue from WJZ in Baltimore, taught me this trick: to look for press releases that most people wouldn't cover and ask yourself, is there a deeper story? And because of that question, I was able to find interesting stories hidden in press releases every now and then. I'll link to some of them from various parts of my career. One is about a man who is giving money away. Another is about something fun to do with pumpkins. Nowadays, going through the recycling bin may not be an option for you, because even when people fax, and yes, people still fax press releases to a newsroom, those faxes come in electronically. They come in digitally to a computer somewhere in the office. And typically they are just as quickly deleted as they are received. So you're probably not going to get a second pass at a lot of this stuff. But you might find a story the way that I did. The people working the assignment desk where I worked at NBC5 are great. Truly hard-working people, even after all of the crazy phone calls they get all day. They would still find the time to put the more interesting press releases or ones of daily news in a folder in iNews. And iNews is news management software by Avid. It's where you can look up the newscast, every show, every rundown, sometimes from multiple stations even in your ownership group, and usually also to see all the wires, the AP wire or any other wire service that your newsroom subscribes to. And a quick side note here, talking about newsroom management software, on the job you'll most likely encounter one of 2 programs. Again, Avid's iNews or the AP software called ENPS. So alright, let's steer back on topic now and talk about how I happened to find a crazy good story in the press release section of iNews. And this happened to be a light feature story about a hockey game happening at 7 p.m. that night. And when you see the story, you'll understand why it caught my attention. I asked my managers if I could do this story, and they actually let me. I'm going through all of this to explain to you that your assignment desk may put some interesting stories in iNews that even they know may never see the light of day because they don't have reporters to assign to it, or simply just may be short-staffed. So it's going to be up to you to find the story in there, and if good, fight for it. No one thought this hockey story was going to be told until I asked and showed enthusiasm for the story. I'll also too leave that link below. The story is called Love of the Game. Mike Shue also taught me an other valuable skill. This one is to drive with the windows down when you're not on the highway and it's not snowing or raining. He recommends doing this so that you can hear anything weird that's going on around you. After all, it might lead to a great story. Most of the time, you're never going to hear anything, but once in a while, you might, and I did. In Fort Worth, I caught this group of people playing music outside a grocery store. I was at a stoplight and heard the music, but couldn't see them because other cars were blocking my view, until the light turned green and I crossed the intersection. I quickly turned into that shopping center, took some video with my old iPhone 3GS, gave them my card, and asked them for their contact info. Turns out they were with a local church trying to interest people in joining. It was wacky enough that I kept them in my list of story ideas, but could never find a newsworthy reason to put them on the air. Plus, other than that day when I originally met them, I never saw them on that corner again, and also never heard through the grapevine that they were on any other corners. Another time this happened was at a workshop in San Marcos, Texas. We were tasked with doing exactly what I'm talking about here. We had to go out and enterprise a story, and in a city that none of us were from and knew nothing about. Our plan was to just drive around and walk into independent mom and pop stores until we found a story. And we'll talk more about that a little later on. The point here is that on our way, much like the church band on the corner, we heard violin music, and I lost the vote that day on rolling the windows down. There were 2 other reporters in the car, and it was a hot day in Texas. They wanted the AC more than the 1 in 100 chance of finding a story. The funny thing is that it didn't matter, because when we were at the stoplight, we heard the violin music, and it was loud enough to blast through our car with the windows up and the AC blaring. That's because this gentleman was playing music to help him pay for school. I jumped out of the car with my camera, and as you can see, it was an exciting choice because it's something you don't see every day. So again, novelty and rarity. There are some reveals that make it an interesting light feature. Be kind though as you watch it. It's an unpolished piece from a workshop, especially the last shot. And I'll be the first to admit it's fuzzy. It's a little blurry. I should have pulled the focus sharper, but I was trying to capture a moment I knew was only going to happen once and was too afraid to risk it. If I had turned the focus one way, it would have been sharp and great, but I wasn't sure to go left or right, and it was either going to sharpen it or make it even more blurry. So the end result is what actually happened. Now let's go back and talk about driving around looking for stories. On an excruciatingly slow news day, this is what I used to do. I stopped in a local lawnmower repair shop one day, and I had no idea what I was looking for or what I would find. I introduced myself and told them that I was looking for stories and just simply asked them how they were. The woman told me she was great because business was booming. I asked her why, and she said because people were finally getting their lawnmowers fixed now that the weather was getting cooler. It gets so hot in Texas, it actually burns the grass. And it's typical for a lawn to be yellow or brown, any color but green, so of course no one mows their lawn when it's consistently hot outside because there's nothing to mow. The summer before, the Dallas-Fort Worth area had more than 40 days in a row where the temperature was over 100 degrees. So of course, no one mowed their lawn. But this season was different, and there had been rain, and because of all of that, when you look at all of these work orders, it's obvious they were backed up. I had a story, and I'll leave a link to that also too at the end of this module. Keeping in touch with sources. Whether it's calling, texting, emailing, or social, keeping in touch with the people you meet on stories is important. That's why it's always a good idea to get a cell phone number when you meet them. I would follow up with sources in 2 ways. The first was to follow up with sources who I had recently put on the air and ask them how things were going depending upon what the story was that I told about them, because there might have been a good reason to do a follow-up. Maybe their problem or solution had gotten worse. Or maybe the story was moving forward, like this woman in Dallas who lost her home to a tornado. This was a bad storm that sent semi-trucks spiraling into the air, and some of them landed on homes. This particular woman had been waiting a while for the insurance to come through so that she could demolish her home and rebuild right there. I would keep in touch with her once a week to see if she had gotten any word. The answer was always no, but she loved that I was interested and kept periodically calling. Then one day when I was doing a follow-up story at a gas station where someone won a huge lotto jackpot, I randomly got a call from her saying that the insurance came through and that they were about to start demolishing her home. Like right then, I had very little time to get from Fort Worth to Dallas. I immediately emailed my producer and my manager, told them what I was told by the woman, and that I had to start the 45-minute drive to Dallas to get this story because it was essentially happening right now. And of course, I would be more than happy if they wanted to make the Lotto story of OSOP, which it was, but they had somebody else write it and edit it. I got there just in time to get some good footage and to meet her on her lunch break from the hospital she works at. It was a good follow-up story too. It was visual, and for once, it was positive because she was finally moving forward. You'll do plenty of stories when the insurance doesn't come through, or a viewer was somehow taken or scammed. I bring all of this up to say that we as journalists get so busy covering breaking news or spot news and following up with just that we often forget to follow up with the stories that we put on air just last week. There were stretches of time when that certainly happened to me. And the second way that I followed up with sources was reaching back out to people who I hadn't talked to in weeks or maybe more than a month, and asking them if there were any new developments about the story that we did together. And if there weren't any new developments and there wasn't anything new going on in their life, I would then ask them this specific question. Do they know of someone or have a friend who had a problem they couldn't solve? It's a little bit of a vague question, but I would specifically, intentionally ask it because all of these people have jobs. So they work somewhere and know people. They also work somewhere that might have some corruption, or at the very least, they or someone they know may be treated unfairly. These people also, too, could have kids, or they are related to some kids, meaning they have a niece or nephew. Those kids, they go to school, so you may be tipped off to an educational story depending upon what's going on with that school or the overall school district. Also, too, someone in their family or someone they know may have just lost their job and is having trouble looking for work. Ask what industry they're in and look up unemployment numbers for that industry as a whole. And then check your state's Workforce Commission website to see how many people have been laid off in that particular industry. Most states, if not all states, require companies to report layoffs to a state agency. If the person was fired, that's a different story. That's for cause, not a layoff. A large amount of layoffs in a particular industry is obviously news. One, because of what's going on with that industry or company, and two, sometimes a follow is that in order to re-enter the workforce, especially for people who are in older industrial jobs for which those jobs don't exist anymore, the solution oftentimes proposed to help those workers get back on their feet, so to speak, is to go through what's called a workforce redevelopment, which is all a fancy way of saying, let's train those people to have some kind of a new job. And it's something that sounds good on paper, sounds good from politicians, but in practicality is hard to pull off. Because sometimes these people are in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, and they're being asked to relearn a skill that is much, much easier for somebody who's younger in age to pick up on, let alone, let's say they did study coding or they did study something new, they did everything we as society asked for them, they may still not get hired because they're too old and index in the unfortunate societal phenomenon that we call ageism, which means that a company isn't going to hire somebody in their 40s or 50s when they can hire somebody in their 20s or 30s simply because this person is cheaper than the older person who naturally has more experience. And that's something you're going to cover every now and again. And I covered this too, as I covered a US citizen who lost his job as an IT worker. He had a hard time looking for a job because while there were other IT companies that he was qualified to look for, most of them liked hiring foreign workers who have what's called an H-1B workers visa, which means that they're able to work in the US legally. That worker is much more willing to take the same job as the person I covered, but for lower pay than him or any average American worker. So, H-1B visas were very much a story in North Texas, and I was put on this story when the wife of the man that we're talking about just happened to be selected to do a Google Plus video conference call. I know, a Google Plus video conference call with then President Barack Obama and asked him what his stance was about allowing H-1B visas and if he was going to do anything to help people like her husband, who was a citizen, obtain U.S. work.
If your husband's in that field, then we should get his resume and I'll forward it to some of these companies that are telling me they can't find enough engineers in this field.
So while this story came to me by way of a small news story involving the president, following up with your sources can produce the same results. And this story is an example of that too, because while I believe the president, I got to meet him once on the job and happen to know lots of other people who've worked with him, because after all, he's from the state in the city I grew up in, Chicago, that even if you believe the president did pass along that gentleman's resume, it didn't result in a job. Because when I made that follow-up call to see if this woman's husband actually ended up getting any kind of a job because of all of the news reporting, not only locally, but I know that CNN and some other networks also too put them on the air nationally, meaning countrywide obviously, that the gentleman didn't get a job. But the more you call sources, the more they get used to you and may actually eventually tip you off to a story. This also too is a great reason to do beat calls. And this one is obvious because making beat calls every day reinforces with the person that you're talking to that one, you're a reporter and you are specifically assigned to that beat and therefore will be dedicated to it. And by dedicated, I mean learning it and reporting on it not only correctly, but also being fair. If you're on the crime beat, you'll call the PIO or the Public Information Officer of the local police departments and also the Sheriff's Department. You may also call County Dispatch asking if anything important happened overnight, but they never really ever told me anything, but they did recognize who I was. It was mostly the public information officers who told me things. If crime is your beat, I recommend going into the police station itself and looking at the police reports and the arrest reports that came in overnight. After all, public information officers won't necessarily tell you everything. It's not their job to, unless you ask. And by finding police reports, you'll also know sometimes exactly what to ask. So now the trick becomes trying to get information from that public information officer that goes beyond the basic report. That becomes hard because they probably weren't the officer on scene, and that officer may still be working on the lengthier report. Not to mention that the public information officer isn't going to tell you anything that you wouldn't know to ask about. It's their job to answer your questions, but at the same time, it's their overall job, the overarching job, to protect the police department. So if that means obfuscating or talking around something you're asking, meaning giving you an answer other than what is the direct and most detailed answer, they're going to do that. But again, work your beat and make the calls. Show up to meetings, city council meetings, county board meetings, school board meetings. Your consistent presence signals to those officials that you are the station's reporter for that beat. And in doing that, you're directly sending the message that you're watching them and that you're going to find good stories. You're not going away. This will earn you credibility with them versus stations that randomly send reporters to this stuff, and by that I mean a different reporter every time. Officials secretly like stations that do that because they know that the reporter doesn't know all that much and at best will ask only basic questions about the story. Therefore, they can get around those questions a lot easier than the more detailed ones that a dedicated beat reporter would know to ask. If the reporter has invested time in other meetings and getting to know other members of the city, they kind of know what they're up to and how they'll vote or why they voted a certain way or what their interest or agenda would be for a particular project or vote. a reporter randomly assigned to go cover that city council meeting or that school board meeting, quite frankly, isn't going to have a clue. So in the end, and it's kind of funny, they won't like that the station actually has a dedicated reporter, but they'll respect it. And at the same time, knowing that they're not going to be able to outsmart that beat reporter as they can other reporters who are randomly assigned to cover those beats sometimes. So you've probably figured out by now that the beat reporter to beat relationship is a bit of a tug of war, a force of wills, if you will. Now let's talk about social media groups. These are a great way to get to know sources. Any group on social media that you find that has activity is going to be good. Facebook groups are good, as are a lot of blogs. Groups and blogs that are offered by mothers are gold, and so are ones by military wives. They pass on information to each other all of the time. So if you're doing stories about issues that affect them or advocate for issues that affect them, they are going to be loyal. There are, of course, many other groups as well. It's just those two happen to be slam dunks. Another great idea is to check out what the other stations within your station's ownership group are doing. I did this during every sweeps period, so every February, May, July, and November. You can do this by going into your newsroom's news management software, probably again iNews or ENPS, and by finding the other stations and then diving into their newscasts. You should be able to see their rundowns and scripts by having read-only privileges, but that's all you need. You certainly don't want to go in and write anything for them or mistakenly edit something states away. The whole point here is that maybe you find a story that you can duplicate in your market. You may even find an idea for a stand-up. And what's cool nowadays is that every station now posts all their video online, so you can actually watch what you're reading out of iNews. This isn't something I could do back when I was doing this stuff. What I was reading, it may or may not have ever found its way online. Some stations too even include the anchor intro and reporter live shots along with the package. So basically, you're seeing the actual air check, what actually aired. And all of this will give you great content to model. So if the live shot or the package was creative, take notes on it and model it. This is also a great way too to see what stations in larger markets are doing within your ownership group. Chances are the station you work at is owned by what's called an ownership group, meaning it owns multiple stations, and all the stations in that family will be connected regardless of what affiliate they are. CBS, ABC, CBS, doesn't matter. They will all be connected through the newsroom management software, so take a look around. For example, when I worked at ABC News Channel 20, it was and still is owned by Sinclair Broadcasting, the Sinclair Broadcast Group, the largest owner of TV stations in the US. And I had access to all of the ones that produced news. We were the ABC affiliate in Springfield, Illinois, and I could see our sister station in Champaign, the CBS station in Cedar Rapids, and the very good flagship station in Baltimore. And that's just a few. Sinclair owns 193 or so stations, though not all 193 actually produce news, but a large chunk of them do. And that's what allowed me to look at what reporters were working on at WBFF when I had a free moment. I'd also then go to their website to watch the actual stories. I mostly watched stories from a reporter called Kathleen Cairns, and stories I knew from iNews that an other mentor of mine, photojournalist Darren Durlack, shot as a photographer. He's only one of two, maybe three people to win the NPPA Photojournalist of the Year award 3 times, and 3 times in a row. So I made sure to watch the stories I knew he shot. And he has now since moved on and started his own production company a year after I did, with 2 other incredible videographers from WBFF. And yes, everyone there knows that their call letters end in BFF. So hopefully all of these tips on how to help you enterprise stories actually helps. And these aren't the only ways to enterprise, but hopefully these help make your list a little bit longer. And as always, if you have any questions about this as you're trying to do it yourself, please feel free to reach out. I'll see you in the next video.